The math behind early retirement is quite simple. If you save 25 times what you spend in a year, you could retire and live off of your investments by withdrawing about 4% of it each year. That's called the 4% rule. For example, if you need $40,000 a year to cover your expenses, you would aim for a $1 million portfolio. That's because 4% of $1 million is $40,000. In theory, this setup could pay you that amount every year forever. But here's where it gets tricky. The 4% rule was originally designed for retirement lasting about 30 years. If you retire early, your retirement can easily last for 40 to 50 years. That's a lot longer. That's why many experts recommend using a lower withdrawal rate, maybe 3.5% or even 3% to make sure your money lasts. So how does that change the math? If you use a 3% withdrawal rate, instead of saving 25 times your annual spending, you would aim for about 33 times. Let's do the numbers. To withdraw $40,000 a year, you would need to save about $1.3 million. If you withdraw $60,000 a year, you would aim for about a $2 million portfolio. Here's the simple rule of thumb that I like to use. If you retire in your 30s, stick closer to 3%. If you retire in your 40s, you could bump it up to 3.5%. And if you retire in your late 50s, 4% is usually fine. Now you might be wondering, what about inflation? That's a great question. And the good thing is that the 4% rule or the 3% rule takes inflation into account already. Here's how it works. Let's say you're 40 years old, you're retired, and your yearly expenses are $40,000 a year. In the first year, you withdraw $40,000. If inflation is 3% the next year, you would withdraw $41,200, and you keep adjusting that amount for inflation every year. As long as you stick to this plan, your money should theoretically last. Let's put all of this together with a couple of examples. You're 40 years old and you want to retire and you anticipate spending $60,000 a year. Using the 3% rule, you would aim for a $2 million portfolio. The first year, you take $60,000. The next year, you bump that up for inflation and so on. If you're 57 years old and you want to retire, and let's say you anticipate spending $40,000 a year, using the 4% rule, you would aim for a $1 million nest egg. Same idea, you adjust each year's withdrawal for inflation, and that's what you withdraw the next year and so on. That's it. The math itself is quite simple. The tricky part are the taxes. So far, we've only talked about numbers without taking taxes into consideration at all. So let's talk about that. Accessing funds from traditional accounts like your 401k before 59.5 triggers a 10% penalty for early withdrawals. Fortunately, early retirees have strategies to get around this. The most popular and the most used strategy for early retirees is the Roth conversion ladder. In simple terms, you gradually convert the money that you need from your traditional 401k / your IRAs into a Roth IRA, and then after waiting 5 years, those converted funds can be withdrawn from your Roth IRA penalty and tax-free. For this, you will have to start conversions 5 years before you actually need the funds. Let's say you're 40 years old and you plan to retire in 2030, and all your money is in a 401k. So in 2025, you will need to convert the money that you will need in 2030. In 2026, you will need to convert the money that you need in 2031, and each conversion must sit in the Roth for at least 5 tax years. After that, it is considered seasoned, and you can withdraw that amount without the 10% penalty because Roth contributions or conversions can be taken out tax-free after 5 years. And by doing a series of these conversions, or hence the ladder, you create a pipeline of money that you can access in your 40s or in your 50s using your 401k funds without penalties. It requires planning ahead, but it is a tried and true technique that many early retirees use to unlock their tax-deferred accounts. There are ways you can access the funds early without penalty, like the SEP. I've actually done a full video on this, but the point is that taxes are a whole another animal and they should be given some serious consideration. But beyond taxes, there's another factor that really gets enough attention. Your spending won't remain constant throughout retirement. When people are planning for retirement, they often assume that they'll need the same $60,000 per year in retirement, adjusted for inflation, of course, but that's rarely how real life works. Retirement spending is dynamic. This study by JP Morgan found that household spending declines steadily even after accounting for inflation. That's where the concept of go-go, slow-go, and no-go year comes in. In your go-go years, you're active, you're traveling, you're pursuing hobbies, maybe even launching a side project. This is where spending is at its peak. Then come the slow-go years, when activity slows down and discretionary spending drops. And finally, in the no-go years, traveling and entertainment nearly vanishes and spending shifts towards healthcare. So while your spreadsheet might say $60,000 for 40 years, reality might look more like $75,000 in the first decade, then $50,000 in the next decade, and then $40,000 in years later. That matters a lot for early retirees, especially because over-planning can lead to oversaving. Understand these phases and plan for these phases accordingly. Okay, now what if you have a rental property? How does that affect the math for early retirement? Owning a rental property can dramatically shift the early retirement math, and here's exactly how. Let's assume that you have a rented property generating $1,500 per month in positive cash flow after taking all taxes, maintenance, vacancies, and other expenses into account. So that's $18,000 a year. Using the conservative 3% withdrawal rule for early retirees, generating an additional $18,000 per year from investments alone would typically require $600,000. But since your rental income is producing that cash flow directly, you can effectively reduce that amount from a target retirement savings. In other words, owning just one rental property could lower your saving goals significantly from, let's say, $2 million down to $1.4 million. Owning two rental properties could reduce it even further to, let's say, $800,000 and so on. And data shows that average annual rent increases have historically hovered between 3 and 5%, which aligns closely with how the 4% rule accounts for inflation-adjusted withdrawals. So the math does get a bit complex, and you'll need to sit down and write the numbers down. Finally, the role of Social Security in all this math. Now, the whole idea that Social Security is going away is BS, at least in my opinion. It is funded by payroll taxes, so I doubt that it will go away completely. The benefits could look very different in the future, but I think it should be included as part of your overall retirement planning. So I'll discuss it briefly over here. The earliest you can begin receiving Social Security is at age 62, though waiting until the full retirement age of 67 or even 70 can result in a larger monthly benefit. Here's why that matters. If you retire at 40 and you plan to live off of your portfolio until age 90, your savings need to support 50 years of spending. If Social Security kicks in, let's say at 67 years old, it could cover 30 to 40% of your expenses from that point onwards, dramatically easing the burden on your portfolio. This creates an opportunity for what's called front-loading your spending. In other words, you might withdraw slightly more from your investments in your 40s and your 50s, knowing that Social Security will offset the need for higher withdrawals later on. So for example, if your target spending is $60,000 per year and you expect $30,000 per year from Social Security starting at age 67, your portfolio only needs to support $60,000 until age 67 and $30,000 annually after that. One last piece of advice. Even with all the planning, life throws curveballs. Market crashes, healthcare cost spikes, a roof that needs replacing, or maybe you decide that you want to help your kids with college tuition, or maybe launch a business in your 50s. The math works best when it is built on flexibility and not rigid rules. That's why some early retirees aim to overshoot their number by 10 to 20%. It gives them that flexibility and that breathing room. Others keep a few years worth of cash or bonds as a buffer against market volatility. At the start of the video, I said that the math behind early retirement is quite simple. And on surface, it is. Save 25 times to 33 times your annual spending, withdraw a small amount each year, and you are good. But as you probably noticed by now that when you factor in tax strategies, Social Security, rental income, maybe even a pension plus variable spending across decades, that simple math starts to look more like a multi-layered puzzle. It's not impossible, but it does take some planning.